When I was 16, at the height of my impatience, I traveled to DC and pretended to be a law student so I could join an international law society and rub elbows with great attorneys. That's how I started learning about human rights and about all the moving parts of the international system, the UN, governments, and NGOs, and how they all work together to address complicated issues. When I turned 17, I started working in sexual violence. My first job was transcribing interviews of rape victims living in the Congo. That first interview changed my life. It was with a nurse who was representing a victim who died in her care, a 6-month-old baby girl. And it was one of those moments where you wake up to what isn't in your own world. And what I saw was not just an individual or a family suffering, but an entire community, an entire society that was facing the material threat of armed conflict and structures of inequality that were deeply embedded. That was when I knew helping survivors would become my life's work. But it also hit me that I had no idea what kind of work would actually make a difference. I thought climbing the ladder of the international system was the only way to go about it, so that's what I did. I worked for the UN, for governments, for NGOs, and I became one of the fiercest and loudest human rights activists out there. I started my own human rights organization at 19, and later on, I became director of a coalition of NGOs, Nobel laureates, and experts of over 5,000, all working to end sexual violence and conflict. And it took me getting there to realize that there was something fundamental missing from the international system, and that there are certain things it's incapable of doing. And it's a symptom of what we in our societies are unwilling to do, of the radical tolerances, empathy, and critical reflection that we don't see. I was at a conference recently, and I was listening to a really passionate group of survivors, and a young girl about 18 stood up, and she shared her frustration with the room, and she said, "Conflicts are becoming more frequent, violence is becoming more brutal, our stories are stalling for international attention. Why are we here? What are we doing that's not working?" I thought this was really compelling and stark, and I just want to delve into that. The problem runs so deep that survivors can physically be at the UN, the seat of the international system, and still feel unheard. This needs to lead us to an embrace of realism. It needs to lead us to a place of understanding that we have not trained ourselves to do the work we need to. And that training comes in investing in the kinds of solidarities that aren't built into the international system. So where to begin? First comes recognition. Part of what's been missing for me from the very beginning is an acknowledgement of complicity, our complicity, the global north, in calling out deeply embedded structures in other countries, but never being comparative. The same structures that exist to disadvantage women in Mozambique and Uganda exist here in Harlem and the Bronx. And to prove that, we showed donors narratives of girls living in Harlem and in Mozambique, and we asked them to take a guess of where the girls were from. And they couldn't do it. They got it wrong every time. And this is really challenging to accept, but the moment that we engage in that system of separates, of them, not us, when we choose to highlight stories of suffering, instead of the choices that were made to allow people to suffer, we fixate on international issues in a way that traps us. So we might feel aware of what's going on, but we never really know what to do about it or how to engage it. Another way to consider recognition are the ways good people might make bad decisions. Here's an example. Nobody in this room can justify why survivors shouldn't be able to set their own agenda. At least I hope not. or why there's a fundamental lack of trust in women, especially black women, who don't have fancy degrees or fancy offices to run their own organization. But that's what happens every single day with donors and with governments. And if we don't claim this, if we don't call ourselves out just by way of naming, of telling truth, we can't reckon with that. We can't hold those questions. Second, there's intention and commitment. Intention here is a willingness to do what we can to understand the world around us and how we play a role in that and how we operate it. That kind of discernment about the role we play is also about knowing ourselves, often uncomfortably, and being willing to be vulnerable. Many of the survivors I've met have echoed my own pain of what it means to be a rape survivor, to have experienced the most intimate kind of violence. That's my vulnerability. It gives me a deep and abiding sense of connection to the issue. But owning yours will allow you, whatever it is, will allow you to be moved by the truth of someone else's situation. And it's from that place that transformative action must come to ensure that we aren't replicating systems of oppression when we try to help people. Part of the problem is an unwillingness, or perhaps fear, of doing difficult personal work and paying attention to one's own community, because it's always there. Poverty and violence in the Congo needs to be eradicated and addressed. But those same structures, which might exist here, are consciously avoided. Once that sort of intention of undoing becomes instinctual for you, it will change how you and others around you approach it. Finally comes action, where you make it real in your everyday life. Remember, we can't fix things about the international system without first reclaiming and repairing our relationship to our community and to the space around us. That's where I think really the paradox in what's possible lies. From the point of view of wanting to do work on international issues, it's to recognize, oh, I'm not trying to be a part of a larger system. In fact, we're trying to unbecome, to invest in communities, to invest in the imaginative excellence of local activists. That's our task. What's yours to do could be right in front of you, and in a small place that's much easier to see. Sometimes it's one connection and strengthening your humility to that space that can make the difference. And we know this works. I know this works. Because the successes we have seen in the world have all come from the bottom up. They haven't come from the top down. It's all from women and survivors working at the grassroots level. When you break open the potential of community work, you find renewal, and you come head to head with the ethos that has led every successful movement in this century and the last one. From the civil rights movement to the interfaith women in Liberia who said enough is enough and they ended the civil war, to the women in Syria today who, however uneasily, are working to take care of children, to tend to graves, to set up soccer clubs to keep their children busy and away from ISIS. That's the movement for peace. It's setting groundwork at the local level. Now imagine if that call to community was built into the system and we carried it with us. We automatically invested in it. Imagine the institutions we're a part of if they automatically invested in this kind of organizing, instead of having to constantly catch up on what's trying to make a difference and what's really making a difference, and that's community. I'm asking you to consider these 3 steps toward reforming the international system as the vital task of the moment. Your determination to shed light on the part of the system that you own here, and to engage with your neighborhood, to lean into that space, even if it's discomforting, will mark you as an activist genuinely committed to international change. And that commitment is not just a message, it's a methodology. Thank you.